Thank you very much, Alan. The name of Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini has already arisen. He was our source for two variant statements on the number of copies printed of the Gutenberg Bible, and we have stayed, of course without certainty, to his rounder figure of 180 against 158. It is remarkable that the earliest unambiguous description of the Gutenberg Bible should have come from so eminent a figure as Aeneas Sylvius, deep-dyed humanist, writer of vivid prose, widely connected and immersed in the ecclesiastical and temporal politics of Europe since the time of the Council of Basel and a future pope. In late October of 1454, Aeneas Sylvius was Emperor Frederick III's deputy at the imperial diet held in the town hall of Frankfurt on Main, and he delivered there an impassioned oration intended to rouse the German nation to unite in resisting the Turkish advance in Hungary. In his commentary, he recalled the speech as a great success. He wrote, "It lasted nearly 2 hours, but the audience was so utterly absorbed that no one even cleared his throat or took his eyes off the speaker's face." While in Frankfurt, Aeneas Sylvius apparently heard about a marvelous man, slide 2 please, who is producing multiple copies of a Bible. Aeneas Sylvius seems not to have met the man himself, that isn't quite clear, but rather to have viewed quires of different books of this Bible, which he described enthusiastically in a letter to his close friend in Rome, Cardinal Juan de Carvajal. The script, this is to follow Martin Davis's translation, is extremely neat and legible, not at all difficult to follow. Your Grace would be able to read it without effort and indeed without glasses. Aeneas Sylvius apparently first wrote to Carvajal about this amazing Bible from Frankfurt, but that letter is lost or undiscovered. Carvajal responded in a letter likewise lost, urgently asking for more information and desiring to acquire a copy. On the 12th of March, 1455, Aeneas Sylvius replied in a letter that is preserved, as you see here in print in a roughly 1480 Cologne incunable. He wrote from the imperial court at Wiener Neustadt, partly affirming what he had written earlier and adding the quires of the Bible had also been sent there to the notice of the emperor. He doubted that he could acquire a copy for Carvajal, for, again in Davis's words, buyers were said to be lined up even before the books were finished. We must interrupt ourselves a moment to note that Aeneas Sylvius had a knack for putting himself in the presence of important Latin Bibles. In the summer of 1462, now Pope Pius II, his itinerant court was in residence at the Abbey of Monte Amiata. In his autobiographical but third-person commentary, Pius recorded that the abbey had a noble but rather barren library, but among whose volumes was a, quote, massive and admirable Old and New Testament written in majuscule letters, that is, the Codex Amiatinus, which Pius Pontifex Cupide vidit, which the Pope looked at eagerly, perhaps longingly. At the very time, late October 1454, when the visiting Aeneas Sylvius was made aware of the Latin Bible being produced in multiple copies near Frankfurt, Gutenberg's DK shop in Mainz had just printed, may we see slide 3 please, on commission for an indulgence campaign to support the defense of the Kingdom of Cyprus, multiple broadside letters of indulgence, partly using his original DK type, but joined with a new small rotunda font of high quality that appears only in this indulgence. These indulgence forms are the earliest precisely datable survivals of European typography, the fragment of one copy having been issued in Erfurt on the 22nd of October, 1454. Could we see another slide, please? The printed forms are as successful for their purpose as the Gutenberg Bible is for its, strikingly cleaner and sharper than the surviving manuscript copies of the same indulgence. The Gutenberg Bible has a single font. The Indulgence joins 2 type fonts, plus 3 cast initial letters, all in a single printing operation that might well have produced more than 1,000 such forms, or even more, about 50 of which survive in full or as fragments. Can we see the 5th slide, please? It is generally supposed, but not entirely certain, that the Gutenberg Bible was completed in 1455. Aeneas Sylvius wrote to Carvajal in March 1455 that if his informants are to be trusted, the Bible had been completed. But he had himself only seen what we may think of as sample quires, both in Frankfurt and in Wiener Neustadt. An absolute date for the completion of the Bible is August 1456, when Heinrich Kramer, could we see the next slide, please, vicar of the Collegiate Church of St. Stephan in Mainz, supplied colophons to both volumes of a now very imperfect paper copy at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, stating that he had rubricated and bound them, dating one volume to 15 August, Feast of the Assumption, the other, which you see here, to 24 August, the Feast of St. Bartholomew. These dates would presumably apply to the completion of the final operation, the binding, both original bindings being long since lost. It may be recalled, as noted at the beginning of the first lecture, that the Church of St. Stephan owned a manuscript Vulgate Bible that had been written only a few years before this printed one. But this Gutenberg Bible, rubricated and bound by Kramer, is likely to have been paid work on his part and not for his church. For added notes in the second volume show that in the 1460s it belonged to the parish church of Ostheim near Aschaffenburg, where the archbishop had a residence. Aeneas Sylvius's description of having seen a number of quires of diverse books links closely to one of the fundamental features of the Gutenberg Bible already briefly alluded to. Unlike the giant Bible of Mainz, written seriatim by its scribe, as its interim dates show, from beginning to end from Genesis to Apocalypse, the Gutenberg Bible was set in type and printed off in parallel sections of text, what we may call composition units. These correspond closely, in fact, to the separate scribal writing units of the Codex Amiatinus 750 years earlier. You have a handout which shows you this: Gutenberg Bible composition units, A through D in subdivisions. There were 4 fundamental composition units in the Gutenberg Bible, dividing it into 4 roughly equal sections. The Octateuch in 13 quires, the books of Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Tobit, Judith, Esther, and Psalms in 20 quires, the sapiential books and prophets in 16 quires, and then the Maccabees plus New Testament in 16 quires. As printing proceeded, sub-composition units were broken off for independent setting. In all, there were 12 sub-composition units, and in fact there were 13 when we take into account a separate composition of the final quire of Psalms, a break from the preceding quire so subtle that it was invisible until hinted at by cyclotron measurements of varying copper to lead ratios in the printing ink. Thus, before printing began, at least 4 type cases had to be filled. Whether 4 presses were built, one for each composition station, is less certain. This type making would have been a significant part of the preparation of printing apparatus to which First Loan was dedicated. We have considerable knowledge of the organization of production in the Bible workshop. Without going into close detail, there have been 4 main stages and angles of approach in understanding this. The first, next slide, please. You see the great scholar here, the first most clearly established by Paul Schwenke a century ago, is the already mentioned 2 states of the Gutenberg Bible type itself. The first with a slightly larger body, not filed down, and the second slightly shorter from filing. The second stage or approach, also most clearly analyzed by Schwenke, was recognizing the main composition units through parallel progressions in the paper supplies printed on in each of the 4 major units. The third stage, refining Schwenke's layout, came with a closer identification of the paper stocks and their tracing in multiple copies of the Bible, and especially the bull's head watermark paper, which Schwenke saw as a single supply, but which can be broken down into 4 different chronologically sequential supplies. The 4th stage, contemporaneous with, but at first separate from the 3rd stage, was the most unexpected: an analysis of the printing inks of the Gutenberg Bible by means of focused bombardment with high-energy protons using the cyclotron particle accelerator at the Crocker National Laboratory, University of California at Davis. The chief investigators were history professor Richard Schwab and director of the laboratory, Thomas Cahill. The protons are ricochets with the electron shells of the different constituents of the printing ink produced X-ray scatter patterns, which can be very precisely calibrated to identify different heavy elements and their relative proportions in the ink. It was discovered that the Gutenberg Bible's ink contained significant quantities of copper and lead, and that the ratios of copper to lead vary considerably from page to page. And, what could hardly have been guessed at beforehand, the same patterns recurred at varying places in each of the 4 composition units. The underlying picture is that the inks of the Gutenberg Bible were made in small batches, essentially perhaps the amount required for a day's press work, and that the precise quantity of lead and copper in each batch varied to measurable degrees. The parallel ink patterns in the 4 main composition units strongly suggest that those pages from different parts of the Bible were being set and printed concurrently. To speak personally, I was the investigator of that 3rd stage, a closer look at the Gutenberg Bible's paper supplies. Professor Schwab and Cahill sent me their results, and I became convinced that their data reflected the historical reality of printing operations in a Mainz workshop more than 500 years earlier, because these ink ratio parallelisms revealed 3 places where there was a hitherto unseen change in composition unit. And one of those 3 places I had, so to speak, predicted just 2 years earlier without any knowledge of the UC Davis experiments. In each case, a closer examination of the typography of the relevant pages showed that the changes of composition units were real, this being documented entirely independently of the ink evidence. This lecture will close with an examination of the 3rd of those places, the insertion of the apocryphal book 4 Ezra into the Gutenberg Bible. The page layout of the Gutenberg Bible was carefully planned according to a hierarchy of initial spaces with, next slide please, 6 line spaces for the beginnings of books, next slide, 4 line spaces for prologues, next slide, 2 line spaces for chapter initials, and next slide, 11, 3 line spaces for certain minor texts, such as the Prayer of Solomon, placed at the end of Ecclesiasticus. The Psalms have their own hierarchy, with 4 line initials for the 6 traditional ferial divisions, marking the first psalm read at matins for each day of the week. Next slide, please. The first psalm, Beatus, with a 6 line book initial followed by, next slide, Psalms 26, 38, 52, 68, 97, 4 line initials, and also for Vespers on Sunday, Psalm 109. Then there are, next slide, 3 line initials, marking the Psalms set at Vespers through the weekdays, Psalms 114, 121, and so forth. This latter subgradation of hierarchy for the Psalms at Vespers is, I have been told by someone of great experience, rare in manuscript Bibles, but dozens of printed Bibles following the Gutenberg Bible followed this minor layout feature, which passed on from printing shop to printing shop. Books, prologues, and chapters beginning with the letter I were set with full-width lines starting with the 2nd letter, it being intended that the initial I itself, next slide please, would be entered in the margin, most conspicuously for the in principio of Genesis. Deviations from this layout are rare. At the beginning of Judges, next slide please, the compositor presumably followed the exemplar in leaving space for a shaped P with its descending staff instead of a 6-line space. And then in Matthew, next slide please, over the course of setting 8 pages, 4 different times, the compositor forgot the rule of outset I in chapters starting with I, and he gave them 2-line spaces, going against the stated hierarchy. In the first days of printing the Bible, this is when the Gutenberg Bible font was in its earlier, larger size, there was an experiment, next slide please, with printing the tituli in red ink by means of a second impression, but the experiment was dropped after just a few pages. Thereafter, the Gutenberg Bible compositors left spaces for tituli to be supplied by rubricators, and a separate rubrication guide, next slide please, of 4 leaves or 8 pages was composed and printed. This guide provided an exact text for the tituli of all the books and prologues, with just a few omissions and errors. And also it gave the traditional tituli that accompanied each of the 150 psalms, some of these being of considerable length. The guide accommodated the text of the tituli exactly, again a few errors apart, to the spaces left by the compositors. In principle, a rubricator writing a textura quadrata hand of the same size as the Bible's type would be able to fit the tituli smoothly and agreeably into each space allocated. The tabula rubricarum was extensively studied in an excellent article by Gerhard Povitz in Gutenberg Jahrbuch 2012, and I have myself examined it in considerable detail. Although copies of the table presumably accompanied every copy of the Gutenberg Bible in sheets, only 2 now survive, having descended respectively with the Vienna and Munich copies of the Gutenberg Bible. The tabula rubricarum is to be seen as one component of the total text of the Gutenberg Bible. We find those texts transcribed, sometimes slightly modified, by a variety of rubricators in the majority of surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible, including that in the Bodleian Library. But not all rubricators used the guide. The rubricator of the paper Munich copy, for example, did not, and neither did the rubricator of the vellum copy of the Vatican, part of the Barberini Library purchased by Pope Leo XIII in 1902. That Barberini copy was used by the editors of the official papal project we have mentioned, the Rome Old Testament, whose first volume, Genesis, was published in 1926. It used the tituli of that copy as the Gutenberg Bible readings in their textual apparatus. This is a small conceptual error in the apparatus, for the Barberini readings for the tituli are not those of the Gutenberg Bible shop. They are the tituli followed by some unknown and unlocated rubricator unconnected with the Bible shop. The true tituli are indeed those embodied in the tabula rubricarum. Its full text would have been available to the Rome editors in Paul Schwenke's posthumous 1923 commentary volume to the 1914 Einzelverlag facsimile of the Berlin Gutenberg Bible. One feature of the Gutenberg Bible both complicates and enriches our knowledge of the project, and at the same time raises a fundamental question, which I think we've raised before. What is a printed edition? This feature was the decision, relatively early in production, to increase the edition size. We have no record of the decision and can only presume with considerable probability that as the edition progressed, it occurred to Fust, if we take him to be the chief entrepreneur of the project, that more copies could be sold than originally planned, and of course that the unit cost diminished with every additional copy made. The number of copies printed off was increased by about a quarter, And just as the original print run was divided into paper and vellum copies, the increase also included both paper and vellum copies. If we agree for convenience to take the final print run as 180 copies, this means the original run would have been of, say, about 135 copies, with an increase of about 45 additional copies, of which it seems relatively more were pulled off on vellum than on paper than in the original run. Next slide, please, number 20. We can identify the exact place where the decision to increase the print run was taken in each of the 4 separate composition units. In the first unit, Pentateuch, 3 full quires of 10 leaves each had been set and printed, and then the first 3 pages of the 4th quire, 1 recto, 1 verso, 2 recto. The compositor had set as far as the middle of Exodus chapter 8. Then in the second unit, starting with the books of Kings, exactly 3 quires had been set and printed, reaching as far as 2 Samuel chapter 21. In the third unit, starting with Proverbs, 1 full quire and 11 pages of the second quire had been set and printed, reaching to early in the Song of Songs. And in the 4th unit, at the right, at the last of the type cases to be set up, it began with 1 Maccabees, and there only the first recto page of its quire had been set and printed when it was decided to enlarge the edition. We can most easily visualize how the increase had to be carried out at this last composition unit. On a particular day, the setting of the first page of 1 Maccabees was sent to press, and let's say 135 copies were pulled on the first sheet of the quire for that unit. First, the paper sheets were printed, then the vellum. The type page was cleaned and broken up, and the types began to be distributed back to the type case. By the time the second page of Maccabees had been set into type, that is the verso of the first page, let's say it's on the following day, the decision to print 180 copies had been taken. Therefore, the 135 sheets with the first recto page already printed were backed up in the second pull with the verso page. And then this was followed by 45 more fresh sheets of paper and vellum, which had no printing at all on their first side. Those 45 sheets could not be completed until the first page of text had been recomposed and printed onto the blank pages. For all 4 composition units combined, there are a total of 155 pages belonging to 10 different quires that had to be freshly set in secondary settings that, of course, would deviate in small ways from the first settings. An analysis of the paper stocks, as well as further ink evidence from the cyclotron X-ray analysis, indicates that all this resetting and reprinting was postponed until the end of the project. Thus, for example, for the text of Genesis, the setting B version of those first 3 quires may not have been put into type and printed off until a year or more after the setting A sheets had been completed and safely set aside. When all the printing was done and individual copies were assembled by gathering quires in correct order, there was clearly no special consideration given to whether the quires contained first or second settings. A certain number of copies could be sold right away by using only the first setting quires, not waiting for the second settings all to be printed off. But the full edition could not be sold off and full profit realized until all the reprinting was done. Some 14 surviving copies, including the Bodleians, are purely of first setting, and so could have been sold while the Bible shop was still finishing its work on the second settings. Of the remaining 30-odd copies, there are more than 20 differing combinations of first and second quire settings, only a few copies sharing a single profile. Again, it should be noted that the Barberini copy, the basis of the Gutenberg Bible readings in the apparatus of the Rome Old Testament, has 8 of its 10 potential quires in the second setting, with the result that there are a number of quite widespread Gutenberg Bible readings, those of the first setting, that are invisible to the apparatus of the Rome Old Testament. The division of the setting of the Gutenberg Bible into distinct and independent composition units brings forward an obvious question: whether these units, or at least the four major units, had different exemplars, that is, different setting copies. It will be recalled that Heinrich Schneider's strongest evidences for distinctive Paris Bible readings in the Gutenberg Bible came within the Octateuch, which was the first composition unit. His notes cite slightly over 160 different passages extending from Genesis to Job. Of these, 100 are within the Octateuch, and just over 60 within the 12 following books from 1 Samuel to Job. At the least, we should not assume as our default belief that a single manuscript Vulgate Bible was the source of the Gutenberg Bible's text. There could have been advantages in using different codices for each composition unit. You would not have to disbind a Bible. And it hardly needs emphasis that in the ecclesiastical metropolis of Mainz, a considerable variety of manuscript Bibles could have been available. This was already implied at the beginning of our first lecture when we referred to 4 manuscripts written in Mainz shortly before or contemporaneously with the Gutenberg Bible workshop, and all 4 themselves were copied from exemplars different from each other and from the Gutenberg Bible, and in one case even the same scribe used 2 different exemplars when writing 2 different Bibles. For that matter, there is a reasonable probability that among the churches, convents, and privately owned books of the ecclesiastics of Mainz, there was at least 1 or more Paris Bible. The manuscript Bible that Schneider found to be closest in shared readings with the Octateuch of the Gutenberg Bible, that's Handschrift Abteilung 267 of the Mainz City Library, appears, in fact, to be probably a Paris-written Bible of the mid-13th century. I'm grateful to 2 colleagues in Vienna, Drs. Christine Bayer and Michela Schuller-Yukas, for their opinion on illumination. Could we have an image of it, please? Yes, thank you. And this, in fact, complicates Schneider's own viewpoint, because he saw this as being an early 14th century Bible of the Rhine region. And so his entire concept of a sort of a floating Rhenish text filtering into the Gutenberg Bible, its strongest piece of evidence probably is wrong. In this case, however, our information on ownership takes us only so far as placing it within the archdiocese in the early 17th century. But another, next slide please, very handsome Paris Bible, now in Stuttgart, its illumination situated by Robert Branner within his Sainte-Chapelle group, and next slide also the same Bible, belonged to the Cathedral of Mainz in 1479. We cannot be certain whether it was at that date a recent arrival or had been in Mainz by mid-15th century. Now, you have the handout which we saw in the second lecture, the text profile of the Gutenberg Bible. It lists at the foot the chief variations from the Paris Bible. There are 22 omitted prologues and 13 added prologues, 2 added texts, and a conspicuous change in layout for the prayer of Manasseh. As to the omitted Paris prologues, if we set aside for the moment the whole group of prologues for the minor prophets, those occur 23 to 39, the other omissions are all prologues that Laura Light has discussed as relatively recent additions to the Bible tradition at the time the Paris Bible was taking shape. K40 and 41, for example, are 2 dedicatory prefaces that Rabanus Maurus in the early 9th century composed for his commentary on Maccabees. And it is probable that their immediate source in the Paris Bible was the Glossa Ordinaria for Maccabees, formed in the late 12th century and heavily based on Rabanus. These particular omissions are not unusual in our comparison group of 15th century manuscript Bibles. Of 82 recorded Bibles from this period, 43 of them omit the Romanus Maurus Paris prologues, K40 and 41, and 39 include them, a roughly equal division. In one of the latter cases, they were added separately by a second hand. Of the Matthew prologue, K44, 32 of the 15th century group lack it, 38 included. Of the Apocalypse prologue, K or Kerr 64, 42 of the 15th century manuscripts lack it, and 29 included. Of the prologues added, 2 are of special interest, those to Psalms and Gospels, as they are genuine prologues of Jerome addressed to Pope Damasus and represent his earliest official, to use the term loosely, statements of his interest in revising and improving the Latin Bible. Again, it is useful to consider their presence in the Gutenberg Bible in the larger context of 15th century manuscript Bibles. 30 of the manuscript Bibles include the Psalms without prologue in the manner of the Paris Bible. 20, like the Gutenberg Bible, add Jerome's preface. As for Jerome's Novum Opus prologue to the Gospels, 40 of the 15th century manuscript Bibles omit it in the manner of the Paris Bible, while 29 include it. Can you see the next slide, please? The planning of the Gutenberg Bible may have intentionally enhanced the Novum Opus prologue as the opening text of the New Testament, for it was allotted a 5-line space under titulus instead of the canonical 4 lines for prologues. And then, next slide, by contrast, the opening of Matthew itself has only a 4-line space instead of the canonical 6. The first lecture noted a small but indicative symptom of the Paris Bible, its incorporation of the apocryphal penitential prayer of Manasseh as the final words of 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Its position there was inharmonious, for this last chapter of Chronicles makes no mention of Manasseh, ending rather abruptly with a decree of King Cyrus of Persia that the Temple of Jerusalem was to be rebuilt. The following prayer of Manasseh, as written in the Paris Bible, was not even given a rubric to indicate that these are the words of Manasseh, whose name is not present in the prayer itself. Could we see slide 26, please? Domine Deus, omnipotens, etc. In the Gutenberg Bible, as jointly determined by the layout of the page and the wording of the Tabula Rubricarum, the prayer of Manasseh was unambiguously separated from 2 Chronicles. Next slide, please. And treated as an independent textual item of fixed position between 2 Chronicles and the prologue to Ezra. And the next slide, please. Its expansion within the hierarchy of texts is emphasized further by its allotment of a 3-line initial space, a higher level than a chapter but lower than a prologue, the same position that we noted in an earlier slide for the treatment of the Prayer of Solomon. It is useful to compare the change in treatment of the Prayer of Manasseh with our group of 15th century manuscript Bibles. A variety of treatments appear. 17 manuscripts lack the prayer, and it has already been noted that these correlate closely with Bibles containing capitula. This group is probably furthest from the Paris Bible. 23 of the Bibles treat the prayer of Manasseh just in the Paris Bible manner, fully incorporated as the final words of chapter 36, 2 Chronicles, though many of these do add a marginal rubric to demarcate it. 2 of the Bibles have the prayer of Manasseh out of position. One wrote it after Job and another after Psalms, treating it almost in the Greek manner as a canticle. 4 of the Bibles made it a separately numbered chapter 37. And finally, 24 of the manuscripts, like the Gutenberg Bible, present the prayer of Manasseh as a separate text item. With regard to prologues, the Gutenberg Bible's greatest deviation from both the Paris Bible and from most 15th century manuscript Bibles is the omission of all prologues to the minor prophets, apart from Jerome's brief prologue of less than a half column, occurs the K22 prologue. The Paris Bible, selected from a rich, older body of prologues of widely varied sources, a fixed set of 16 prologues, including 3 prefacing Amos and 2 each prefacing Joel and Jonah. Kerr, following Stegmuller, mistakenly gave 2 numbers as 29 and 30 to what is in fact a single prologue to Obadiah. The common situation in 15th century manuscript Bibles was to add prefaces to the Paris Bible set, and sometimes also omitting prologues from the Paris set. Only 13 Bibles of the 15th century group restricted their prologues to the Paris set, some of these with omissions, whereas 61 of the Bibles added to the set. Altogether, the 15th century manuscript Bibles present well over 50 different prologues for the minor prophets. An exception to this is the 3 Windesheim Bibles, which, like the Gutenberg Bible, have only Jerome's prologue. These apart, only a single Bible of the early 15th century is without supplementary prologues to the minor prophets. And with this as background, I propose what is a confessedly untestable hypothesis. The Gutenberg Bible's exemplar for the minor prophets, we will say, probably did not lack supplementary prologues, for very few Bibles did. This would have been an anomaly. Rather, I hypothesize an editorial or printing shop decision was made to leave out the prologues present in the exemplar, so that the full text of the minor prophets could be fitted completely within the 3 quires, 14 to 16 of Volume 2, that constituted a separate composition allotment for the texts of Daniel and then the minor prophets. The minor prophets' prologues of the Paris set add up in length to about 1/5 of the text of the prophets themselves. A calculation of how much text remained to be set, if made when Daniel was finished on the second leaf of Quire 15, would have shown that there would be a problem in getting all of the minor prophets into the remainder of Quire 15 plus 1 more quire if the prologues were kept. To omit those prologues would save a good 7 or 8 leaves. As it happened, without the prologues, Quire 16 still needed to be extended by a singleton leaf, but this allowed the last prophet, Malachi, to be completed on column B of the verso of that 11th leaf with 5 blank lines to spare. For Ezra. The Gutenberg Bible made one major addendum to the Paris Bible sequence of biblical books, the 4th book of Ezra, immediately following 3 Ezra. 4 Ezra is a composite of 3 texts that did not enter the Bible until the late 8th or early 9th centuries, although several of its constituents were known to Christian writers in the 4th and 5th centuries. In the Gutenberg Bible, which set the pattern followed by the Clementine Vulgate and today by the modern Stuttgart Vulgate, 4 Ezra is printed as a unified book divided into 16 chapters. Its 3 components, each originally a different text. Chapters 1 and 2 is the first of the 3. Modern scholars call that 5 Ezra. And then chapters 3 to 14, as we find it printed today, the major portion, is called 4 Ezra. Chapters 15, 16, modern scholars refer to as 6 Ezra. This is indeed exceedingly confusing. To try to avoid confusion, we will refer to them simply by their individual modern chapter numbers. 4 Ezra chapters 1 to 2 is a presumably Christian prophetic work of a certain Ezra, son of Cusi, roughly datable to the 3rd or 4th centuries Common Era. The major section, 4 Ezra chapters 3 to 14, is a Jewish apocalypse of 7 visions of the scribe Ezra, datable to about 100 CE. And then 4 Ezra chapters 15 and 16 is a Christian prophetic work which does not, at least in the form in which it survives, name Ezra as its author or speaker. It has been dated to the later 3rd or early 4th century CE. All 3 Latin texts are by good evidence translations from now lost Greek versions. A small 4th century Greek papyrus fragment containing a snippet of 4 Ezra chapter 15, 3 verses only, was discovered in the Oxyrhynchus excavations and is here in Oxford. The Jewish Apocalypse of Ezra is generally accepted as having had a lost Hebrew or Aramaic original behind its lost Greek. That lost Greek version, that is chapters 3 to 14 only, was the source for other early Christian versions, including Syriac, Ethiopic, Georgian, and Arabic. The two Christian components, chapters 1 and 2, and then 15 and 16, are only known in Latin, except for that Oxyrhynchus scrap. The earliest witnesses to 4 Ezra fall into two recensions, French and Spanish. For our purposes, only the French recension, the basis of nearly all later manuscript copies, will need to be considered. There are two primary witnesses to the French recension. The first, could we see the next slide, is Aeneas Manuscript 10, a small codex containing all 4 Ezra books that may have been written in the late 8th century as a supplementary volume to the multi-volume Bible of Maudramnus, abbot of Corbie, who died in 781. And let's see the next one and the next one. So those are the Aeneas Manuscript 10, treating each of the components as a separate book. The second witness is Bibliothèque Nationale Latin 11504 and 11505, 2 volumes from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a giant Bible datable to the 8th regnal year of Louis the Pious, that is 821 or 822. And could we see its slide? Its Tobit and Judith are in Old Latin versions. A substantial lacuna in the 7th chapter of 4 Ezra in this Bible. Next slide, please. On the far left, you can just see the stub of the leaf that was torn away. An early leaf was torn out of this manuscript, shows that all later copies, except a few of the Spanish reception, descend from this manuscript because all of that text is missing in them. This lacuna in the text has been referred to as the San Germanensis gap. The undamaged text in Aeneas Manuscript 10 did not come to light until the last quarter of the 19th century, when it was discovered by Robert Bensley, sublibrarian of Cambridge University Library. It should be emphasized that in both early witnesses, Aeneas and San Germanensis, as you've seen, the 3 components of 4 Ezra were written out as individual books, not as a single book, each with tituli and initials demarcating their constituent parts. 4 Ezra, in its 3 parts, hardly ever was written in Bibles until it began to make sporadic reappearances in the late 12th century and after. One curiosity is that a distinctly English form of 4 Ezra came to be written, in which it was intertwined with 3 Ezra. The sequence of texts there is 4 Ezra chapters 1 and 2, and then all of 3 Ezra, and then 4 Ezra chapters 3 to 14, and then as a separate item 4 Ezra chapters 15 and 16, each section marked off from the other. Moreover, when 4 Ezra is presented in this way in Bibles, 3 Ezra is almost always not the Vulgate version, but an alternative revised form of the Vulgate that Stegmüller refers to as version B. This recension by an anonymous reviser, presumably in the Carolingian period, considerably changed various wordings according to the later so-called Lucianic revision of the Septuagint's Esdras A or Esdras Alpha, the Greek equivalent of Latin 3 Ezra. My own notes on some 82 Bible manuscripts of the 13th to 15th century containing 4 Ezra identifies 33 Bibles presenting 3 and 4 Ezra written in the intertwined English manner, and surely there are more. 4 Ezra was written, but only rarely, in Paris Bibles, and one addendum to that small group of Proto-Paris Bibles we mentioned, as defined by Laura Light, it does include 4 Ezra. An indication of the more or less maverick quality of 4 Ezra in later Bibles is that no stable system of chaptering ever developed. Depending on the Bible, 4 Ezra chapters 1 and 2, for instance, that first section, was sometimes written as a continuous text, and sometimes with as many as 5 chapters, or other divisions marked off with versal letters. Nor would, say, one copy's chapter 2 necessarily be marked at the same place as another copy's chapter 2. For all 3 parts of 4 Ezra, the 80-odd manuscripts I've examined, in which we have full details, mark chapter or versal divisions at well over 200 different places. A study of the history of 4 Ezra in Vulgate Bibles, published in 2015 by the eminent biblical scholar Pierre Bogart, made an important observation regarding the Sen-Germanensis gap, the already mentioned lacuna in the text of chapter 7, created by the excised leaf of the Saint-Germain Bible. Bogart noted at the place of this gap, later scribes adjusted the text to disguise the dislocation. And you have a handout, it's on the second page that you picked up, called the Sen-Germanensis Gap and Suture. I thought you needed the words in front of you rather than my just reading them. In the Saint-Germain manuscript, the first words of the page following that torn-out leaf begin, Primus Abraham propter Sodomitus, et Moises pro patribus qui in deserto peccaverunt, and goes on. Clearly a verb was missing, and it had to be one that related to Abraham's intercession in Genesis chapter 18 on behalf of the city of Sodom. Bogart discovered that various Bibles with 4 Ezra repaired the passage in either of 2 ways, which we may call suture A and suture B, as you see here. Suture A, Primus Abraham propter Sodomitas oravet. Or a whole other group of Bibles did it et dixi, Primus Abraham oravet propter Sodomitas. Well, comparing these with my group of 4 Ezra Bibles, I found an equal division. About 38 witnesses have suture A, and 38 have suture B. And looking at them, it became clear that suture A was the French suture, and B was the English suture. So the next question, of course, was which suture is represented in the Gutenberg Bible? Curiously, the Gutenberg Bible's suture is a hybrid. Et dixi, primus Abraham propter Sodomitas oravet. So it has et dixi from the English suture, followed by the word order of the French suture. Although the great majority of the late, that is, 13th to 15th century copies of 4 Ezra maintained its tripartite structure, treating it as a composite of related texts, there are 8 manuscripts in the group of 82 who wrote it from beginning to end as a unitary work, that is, in the manner of the Gutenberg Bible. Most of the 8 are obviously unrelated to the Gutenberg Bible, but there is a group of 3 Bibles of the second half of the 13th century, one said to be French but not a Paris Bible, and 2 probably German, all of which write 4 Ezra as a single book, and all of which divide the text into 31 chapters at the same places. One of the 3 in the Landesarchiv of Koblenz, in fact, formerly belonged to the Carthusians of Mainz and would have been there in the time of Gutenberg. In the early 15th century, the prior of the Charterhouse had this small format Bible bound with a missal and a shortened breviary so that it could serve as a vademecum. Heinrich Schneider, in fact, studied this manuscript in his monograph on the text of the Gutenberg Bible, but concluded that it had no textual connection with the Gutenberg Bible. None of these 3 manuscripts with unitary 4 Ezra, however, has the hybrid manner of the Sen-Germanensis suture that appears in the Gutenberg Bible. They all have the French suture. No manuscript has the version in the Gutenberg Bible. So we may sum up 4 Ezra in the Gutenberg Bible as follows. It was a late addition, the decision to add the text being made when the project was roughly halfway through. It was worked into the 25th quire of the first volume, this is within the second composition unit, in such a way that one compositor could continue setting 3 Ezra on the 4th and 5th sheets of that quire, while a second compositor could begin setting 4 Ezra on the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st sheets, whose first halves already had 3 Ezra printed on them, but whose counter halves, leaves 8, 9, and 10, were still blank. This compositor then completed 4 Ezra by continuing into a 26th quire. The copy text for 4 Ezra was probably some manuscript like the group of 3 just mentioned, that is, one in which 4 Ezra was treated as a single book. The division into 16 chapters, however, must have been editorial work in the Gutenberg Bible shop, for no 4 Ezra manuscript so far examined has chaptering even peripherally related to the 16 chapters of the Gutenberg Bible. We may suppose that the editor marked the 16 chapters roughly on the model of the 9 chapters of preceding 3 Ezra, for the average chapter length of 3 Ezra into 9 chapters and 4 Ezra into 16 chapters is very nearly equal. The hybrid treatment of the Sangermanensis suture is probably also to be seen as editorial, not historical, as it has no precedent in the manuscript tradition and may in fact have been drawn from putting together 2 manuscripts. The most striking editorial change in preparing 4 Ezra for the compositor comes at the beginning of chapter 3, the beginning, that is, of the Jewish Ezra Apocalypse, which is the central core of Latin 4 Ezra. Can we see the next slide, please? Yes, this is a French Paris Bible at the Newberry Library. All manuscripts begin with the prophet Ezra naming himself. It starts in the 30th year after the destruction of our city. I, Salathiel, who am also called Ezra, was in Babylon. And I was troubled as I lay on my bed, and my thoughts welled up in my heart, and so forth. In the Gutenberg Bible, but in no manuscript, the name of the speaker is removed. And so if you look there, you do not see those words, ego salathio qui et Ezra. The reason must have been what we might call literary. When the 3rd chapter of 4 Ezra was the beginning of a new work, it was natural for Ezra, of course, to name himself. But when the 3rd chapter was treated as a continuation of the preceding chapter, the repetition became excessive. For just a few verses before, at the end of chapter 2, we have, for instance, I, Ezra, received a command from the Lord, followed by I, Ezra, saw on Mount Zion a great multitude. Yet another naming of the speaker might well have seemed superfluous. Just this argument was made 180 years ago by an Oxford scholar. Richard Lawrence, Regius Professor of Hebrew and Canon of Christ Church, edited Ethiopic versions of 3 apocryphal Christian writings, the last of which, published in 1820, was the Apocalypse of Ezra, that is, the corresponding text to 4 Ezra chapters 3 to 14. He had found this manuscript by chance in a bookseller's shop in Drury Lane. Lawrence's curiosity extended to the Latin version of 4 Ezra. He wrote that he had examined 187 Latin Bibles, 127 of them in Oxford and 70 in the British Museum. He did not venture to Cambridge. 13 only of the 187 contained 4 Ezra, and in all of these, the beginning of chapter 3 included those words, ego salathio qui et Esdras. Yet, he noted that Fuston Schiffer's Bible of 1462, which he took as the Editio Princeps, excluded those words. Again, the Gutenberg Bible was at his hand in the Bodleian, but he was unaware of it. Lawrence interpreted the omitted phrase thus. It seems, he wrote, that as the transcriber from whose copy the first edition of Fuston Schiffer was derived, well, that actually would have been the Gutenberg Bible, made this the 3rd and not the 1st chapter of the book, That being so, the formal commencement, ego salatio quiet Esdras, was suppressed as altogether unnecessary, which words are entirely omitted in all the printed editions. In 4 Ezra, more closely than in any other text of the Gutenberg Bible, we sense the hand of an editor. Thank you.